The village of St. Mary Mead possessed that peculiar stillness which seemed, to an outsider, almost contrived like a painting too carefully composed to be entirely natural. The hedgerows were clipped to polite obedience, the cottages leaned companionably toward one another, and the church spire rose with modest authority above it all. Life here was orderly, predictable, and if one were inclined to believe its residents, entirely free of unpleasant surprises. It was precisely the sort of place where something dreadful could occur without warning. On a crisp autumn morning, as the mist still clung low over the meadows, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window with her knitting. Her hands moved with practiced ease, though her eyes were not upon her work but rather on the lane beyond her garden gate. "There is something most irregular about that," she murmured. Her companion, Mrs. Hartnell, who had called in unannounced, and was now enjoying tea and a generous slice of seed cake, glanced up. "My dear Miss Marple, you say that about nearly everything." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not at all. Only about those things that are irregular." "And what, pray, is irregular this morning?" "The coffee shop," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Hartnell followed her gaze. "You mean that new place? The Willow Bean, is it not? I never approved of it myself. Far too modern. Those dreadful little tables on the pavement." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Quite so. But it is not its style that concerns me. It is the fact that it is closed." Mrs. Hartnell blinked. "Closed? At this hour, precisely." The Willow Bean coffee shop had, in its short existence, become something of a curiosity. Run by a young widow, Mrs. Eleanor Price, it opened early, very early, and was known for its punctuality. At precisely 7:30 each morning, its door would be unlocked, its windows flung open, and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee would drift into the street. Yet now, at nearly 10 o'clock, the curtains remained drawn, and the small chalkboard sign outside still bore yesterday's menu. Mrs. Hartnell sniffed. "Perhaps she is unwell. Perhaps she is unwell. Perhaps," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Though Mrs. Price is not the sort of person to neglect her business without notice. Then maybe she has gone away." "Without telling anyone?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I think not." Mrs. Hartnell shifted uneasily. "You don't suppose—" But Miss Marple had already risen. "I believe," she said gently, "that I shall take a little walk." By the time Miss Marple reached the Willow Bean, a small cluster of villagers had gathered outside. Among them was Colonel Bantry, looking mildly irritated, and his wife, Dolly Bantry, who appeared both curious and faintly excited. "My dear Miss Marple," Lady Bantry exclaimed. "Have you heard? The most extraordinary thing." "I had noticed that the shop was closed," said Miss Marple calmly. Yes, but that is not the half of it. The door is unlocked, and no one answers when you call. Colonel Bantry says we ought not to interfere. "But really, my dear Dolly," said the Colonel, "one cannot simply go barging into people's premises." Lady Bantry waved him aside. "Nonsense. Something may be wrong." At that moment, the village constable, Mr. Pritchard, arrived, somewhat out of breath. "What's all this, then?" he asked. "The shop is open but unattended," said the Colonel. "We thought it best to inform you." Mr. Pritchard nodded gravely. "Quite right, sir. I'll just take a look." He pushed the door gently. It swung inward with a soft creak. A hush fell over the assembled villagers. Inside, the shop was dim. The curtains, though drawn, allowed slivers of pale light to penetrate. Chairs were neatly arranged, cups stacked, and everything appeared, at first glance, perfectly in order. Too perfectly in order. Mr. Pritchard stepped inside, despite the Colonel's protests by Lady Bantry and Miss Marple. The air was faintly scented with coffee, but beneath it lingered something else, something sharp and metallic. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly about the room, taking in every detail. The counter was clean, the till was closed. A tray of freshly baked scones sat untouched. "And then there," said Lady Bantry in a whisper. Behind the counter, partially obscured from the doorway, lay a figure. Mrs. Eleanor Price. She was sprawled on the floor, one arm outstretched, her face turned slightly to one side. Her expression was oddly peaceful, as though she had simply lain down to rest. But the stillness was unmistakable. Mr. Pritchard knelt beside her, his face pale. He touched her wrist, then withdrew his hand. "I'm afraid—" he began, then stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I think we may be quite certain." Lady Bantry pressed a hand to her mouth. "How dreadful!" The Colonel, who had reluctantly followed them in, removed his hat. "Poor woman." Miss Marple said nothing. She had noticed something else. On the counter, beside a single porcelain cup, was a small glass vial, empty. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with astonishing speed. By noon, it was generally agreed that Mrs. Price had died suddenly and mysteriously, and by tea time, it was widely suspected that she had been poisoned. By evening, speculation had turned inevitably to blame. "It is most unfortunate," Mrs. Hartnell confided to Miss Marple later that day, "but people are already talking." Miss Marple, who was once again seated by her window, looked up. "Talking, my dear?" "Well," Mrs. Hartnell hesitated. "It seems that Lady Bantry was among the first to enter the shop." "Yes, I believe she was. And you know how people are, they will say anything. Some have even suggested, though I do not for a moment believe it, that she may have disturbed something, or even," she lowered her voice, "had something to do with it." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "People often say such things when they are frightened. It gives them a sense of control, but surely no one could seriously suspect Lady Bantry." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple gently, "she is precisely the sort of person who might be suspected." Mrs. Hartnell stared. "My dear Miss Marple, think of it," Miss Marple continued. "She is well known, well connected, and was among the first on the scene. That alone is enough to attract attention, and if there are any misunderstandings in her past dealings with Mrs. Price, were there?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "I do not yet know," she said, "but I intend to find out." The following morning, Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham. He was a sensible man, with a calm manner and a keen eye, and he greeted Miss Marple with evident respect. "I understand you were present when the body was discovered," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though I am afraid I can offer little beyond what you already know." "On the contrary," said the inspector, "your observations are often most valuable." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That is very kind of you." He glanced at his notebook. Miss Price was found behind the counter. No signs of struggle. A vial, believed to have contained poison, was discovered nearby. Preliminary examination suggests that the poison was ingested most likely in coffee. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That would seem likely. There is also the matter of the shop's early closure," he continued. "It appears that Mrs. Price never opened that morning." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, which suggests that whatever occurred before 7:30 precisely. "And yet," said Miss Marple, "the shop was in perfect order. The scones were freshly baked, the cups were clean, everything was prepared for opening." Inspector Craddock nodded. "Yes, that is puzzling. It suggests," said Miss Marple, "that Mrs. Price began her usual routine and was interrupted by the poison, perhaps, or by someone else." The inspector looked at her thoughtfully. "You believe she may not have been alone?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In my experience, Inspector, very few things in life are entirely solitary." As the day wore on, the list of those who had reason to visit the Willoughby and, perhaps to wish its owner harm, began to take shape. There was Mr. Harold Finch, the grocer, who had been heard to complain bitterly about Mrs. Price's success drawing customers away from his shop. There was Miss Clara Dunning, a schoolteacher with a quiet manner and a habit of visiting the coffee shop daily, perhaps too daily. There was Mr. Basil Trent, a charming but somewhat dubious gentleman who had recently taken rooms in the village and seemed to have formed a particular acquaintance with Mrs. Price. There was Mrs. Edith Clements, who had once employed Mrs. Price and had parted with her under circumstances that were, at best, strained. And, of course, there was Lady Bantry herself. Miss Marple considered each in turn, her mind moving gently but inexorably through possibilities. "Motive," she murmured. "Opportunity. And above all, character." For it was character, she believed, that lay at the heart of every crime. And in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else, or thought they did, character was a thing both intimately familiar and dangerously misunderstood. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "I think," she said softly, "that this coffee shop closed rather earlier than it ought." And with that, she began to consider why. The morning following the discovery dawned with a deceptive brightness, as though St. Mary Mead itself were determined to deny the unpleasantness that had crept into its orderly existence. Sunlight lay gently upon the hedgerows, and the church bells rang out with their usual calm authority. Yet beneath this veneer, something had shifted. People spoke more quietly, doors closed more firmly, and eyes once open and friendly now watched with careful calculation. At the center of it all, the Willowbean coffee shop remained shuttered. Miss Marple, having taken her breakfast, set out at a deliberate pace toward the high street. She paused briefly at the grocer's, where Mr. Harold Finch stood behind the counter arranging apples with unnecessary precision. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," she said pleasantly. He looked up, his expression tightening for just a fraction of a second. Miss Marple, sad business that. Very sad, she agreed. Miss Price was a most capable woman. Mr. Finch sniffed. Capable perhaps. Though I've always said these modern ideas coffee shops and such don't belong in a village like ours. Indeed, said Miss Marple mildly. They upset the balance, he continued. Take trade away from established businesses. Not that I begrudge anyone their living, he added quickly, though the sentiment rang somewhat hollow. No, of course not, said Miss Marple. She selected a small bag of tea, then paused. You must have seen Mrs. Price quite often, being neighbors as you are. Seen her, yes. Spoken, not so much. Did she seem troubled of late? Mr. Finch hesitated. I couldn't say. Miss Marple watched him quietly. You are quite sure? Well, he shifted his weight. There was a gentleman, came by frequently. Didn't care for the look of him. Mr. Basil Trent, Miss Marple suggested. That's the one. Smooth talker, the sort that brings trouble with him. Did you ever see them quarrel? No, but that doesn't mean there wasn't something going on. No, said Miss Marple softly. Indeed it does not. From the grocer's, Miss Marple made her way toward the schoolhouse. Lessons had not yet begun, and Miss Clara Dunning stood in the small garden, trimming a rosebush with careful attention. Good morning, Miss Dunning. The younger woman turned, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple, I suppose you've come to ask questions. My dear, I should never presume, said Miss Marple gently. But if you feel inclined to talk. Miss Dunning hesitated, then sighed. I did know Mrs. Price quite well. In fact, you visited the coffee shop regularly. Yes. A faint flush rose to her cheeks. It was pleasant there. Quiet. And Mrs. Price was always kind. Kindness is not always appreciated as it ought to be, said Miss Marple. Miss Dunning looked down at her hands. People will say things, I expect. They always do. There was nothing improper, she said quickly. If that is what you are thinking. I am thinking nothing at all, said Miss Marple, only listening. Miss Dunning took a breath. Miss Price confided in me a little. She was worried. About Mr. Trent? Yes. She said he had been pressing her for money, I think. Or perhaps something else. She would not be specific. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Did she seem frightened? Not exactly. But uneasy. Uneasy, Miss Marple repeated softly. That is often more telling than fear. The next call was at the vicarage, where Mrs. Edith Clements received Miss Marple with a stiffness that bordered on hostility. I cannot imagine what I have to say that would interest you, she said, as she poured tea with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. You were once Mrs. Price's employer, Miss Marple said. Yes. She worked for me as a companion. It did not end well. No, she was ambitious, too ambitious for her position, always wanting more than was appropriate. In what way? Mrs. Clements pursed her lips. She had ideas above her station, and a tendency to involve herself in matters that did not concern her. Such as? That is hardly relevant now, Mrs. Clements said sharply. Miss Marple regarded her quietly. On the contrary, I believe it may be most relevant indeed. For a moment, it seemed Mrs. Clements might refuse. Then she said, in a low voice, she knew things, about people, private things, and she was not above using that knowledge. Blackmail, Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Clements did not answer directly. I dismissed her. That is all. And yet she remained in the village. Yes, said Mrs. Clements bitterly, and prospered. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the company of Dolly Bantry, who was in a state of considerable agitation. My dear Miss Marple, this is quite intolerable, Lady Bantry declared. To be whispered about me, of all people. People are foolish, said Miss Marple calmly. But to suggest that I only went in because the door was open. I know that, said Miss Marple. And now the inspector has been asking questions. Perfectly polite, of course, but one can tell what is in his mind. Miss Marple looked at her kindly. Tell me, Lady Bantry, had you any dealings with Mrs. Price? Well, Lady Bantry hesitated. Nothing of consequence. My dear, said Miss Marple gently, it is always best to be entirely frank. Lady Bantry sighed. Very well. There was a small matter. A subscription list for the church fete. Mrs. Price declined to contribute, and I may have pressed her rather more than was necessary. And how did she respond? Quite coolly. Said she preferred to keep her affairs private. Did that offend you? Of course it did. But not to the extent of wishing her dead, Miss Marple. Of course not, said Miss Marple soothingly. She paused. When you entered the shop, did you notice anything unusual? Lady Bantry frowned. Well, now that you mention it, yes, there was a cup on the counter. I thought it odd. At the time. Only one cup. As though she had been expecting someone or had just served someone. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked in her mind, though her hands were still. Only one cup, she murmured. That evening Inspector Craddock called upon Miss Marple once more. We have confirmed that the poison was indeed in the coffee, he said. A fast-acting substance. Mrs. Price would have had little time to react. And the vial, Miss Marple asked, contains traces of the same poison. No fingerprints, unfortunately. Most inconvenient, said Miss Marple. There is something else, he continued. We have learned that Mrs. Price had recently come into possession of a sum of money, a considerable sum. Ah, said Miss Marple, that is interesting. We cannot yet account for its source, nor, I imagine, for its destination. Inspector Craddock smiled faintly. You are quite right, the money is missing. Miss Marple nodded. Then we have not only murder, but motive of a very practical kind. Indeed. Though which of our suspects is responsible remains to be seen. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. Let us consider them, shall we, Mr. Finch, said the inspector. Resentful of her business success. Yes, but resentment alone rarely leads to murder, said Miss Marple, unless accompanied by something more personal. Miss Dunning, a gentle soul. But gentleness can conceal great depth of feeling. Mrs. Clements, a woman with something to hide, I think, and a strong dislike of the victim. And Mr. Trent, Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. A charming man is often the most dangerous kind. Inspector Craddock nodded. We shall be questioning him tomorrow. Do, said Miss Marple. I should be most interested to hear what he has to say. As the inspector took his leave, Miss Marple remained by the fire, her thoughts moving quietly but persistently. A cup of coffee. A missing sum of money. A woman who knew too much. And a village where appearances mattered very greatly indeed. She picked up her knitting once more. In St. Mary Mead, she murmured, one must never forget that even the smallest thread may unravel the whole. And somewhere, she felt certain, a single overlooked detail, something as simple as a cup left upon a counterwood, proved to be the key to everything. If St. Mary Mead had seemed unsettled before, it now took on a distinctly strained airs, though the village itself were holding its breath. The inquest into Mrs. Eleanor Price's death had been brief but sufficient to confirm what everyone had already suspected. She had died of poisoning, administered in her morning coffee. There had been no sign of forced entry, no indication of struggle, and no immediate evidence to point decisively toward any one individual, which, as Miss Marple often observed, was precisely when matters became most interesting. The following day brought with it a new development, one that caused no small stir among the villagers. Mr. Basil Trent had disappeared. He's gone, Inspector Craddock told Miss Marple, his tone grave. Left his lodgings sometime during the night. No word, no forwarding address. Miss Marple, who was seated in her usual chair, regarded him over the rim of her teacup. That is unfortunate, she said. Unfortunate, the inspector repeated. Surely you mean suspicious. Oh, certainly suspicious, Miss Marple agreed. But also unfortunate. It is always so much easier when people remain available to answer questions. Inspector Craddock allowed himself a faint smile. You believe he is guilty then? Miss Marple shook her head. I believe he wishes to appear guilty. The inspector raised an eyebrow. That is a curious distinction. Not at all, said Miss Marple. In my experience, Inspector, there are those who run away because they are guilty, and those who run away because they fear being thought guilty, and occasionally, though more rarely, those who run away because they wish others to believe them guilty. And Mr. Trent falls into which category? That, said Miss Marple gently, is what we must determine. Meanwhile, suspicion, once a vague and shifting thing, began to settle more firmly upon certain individuals. Chief among them, to Miss Marple's quiet disapproval, was Dolly Bantry. I cannot step outside my own door without feeling eyes upon me, Lady Bantry complained, pacing her drawing room. It is most disagreeable, my dear Dolly, you must not let it trouble you, said Miss Marple. But it does trouble me, to think that anyone could suppose, she broke off, visibly distressed. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. Tell me, Lady Bantry, when you entered the coffee shop that morning, you said there was a single cup on the counter. Yes, I remember it distinctly now. And nothing else? No second cup? No sign that someone had been sitting? No, I don't think so. That is very curious, Miss Marple murmured. Why? Because if Mrs. Price had been serving someone, one would expect some evidence of it. And yet there was only one cup. Lady Bantry frowned. Then perhaps she had not yet served them. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. Or perhaps the situation was not quite what it appeared to be. That afternoon, a further piece of the puzzle emerged, one that cast an entirely new light upon the matter. Miss Clara Dunning called upon Miss Marple, her usual composure replaced by visible agitation. "I have done something foolish," she said at once. "My dear, we all do foolish things from time to time," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Pray sit down." Miss Dunning did so, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "I did not tell you everything," she said. "About Mrs. Price?" "No," said Miss Marple. "There was a letter. She showed it to me only briefly. It was from someone in London. A man. What sort of man, I do not know, but it frightened her." "In what way?" "She said that if she did not comply, everything would come out. Those were her exact words." Miss Marple's eyes grew very still. "Everything," she repeated softly. "Yes. And did she say what that everything might be?" Miss Dunning shook her head. But she burned the letter almost immediately after showing it to me." "How very prudent," said Miss Marple. "Do you think it has something to do with her death?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that it has everything to do with it." At the same time, Inspector Craddock's inquiries into Mrs. Price's finances began to yield results. She had been receiving money regularly, he told Miss Marple that evening, from several different sources. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "Yes, small amounts, but frequent. Enough to suggest a pattern." "Blackmail," said Miss Marple quietly. "It would seem so. And the recent larger sum, we believe it may have been a final payment, or perhaps the result of a more serious threat." Miss Marple nodded. "Then Mrs. Price was playing a dangerous game, and it appears she lost." Yet even as suspicion deepened around Mrs. Price's activities, another, more subtle thread began to emerge, one that Miss Marple found increasingly difficult to ignore. It concerned Mr. Harold Finch. "There is something about him," she remarked to the inspector. "Something that does not quite fit." "He had motive," said Craddock. "Business rivalry." "DS, but that is too obvious," said Miss Marple. "Mr. Finch is not a man of bold actions. He is cautious habitually so. Such men do not commit impulsive crimes. Poisoning is hardly impulsive." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "which is precisely why it does not suit him." The real turning point came quite unexpectedly. It was Mrs. Hartnell, of all people, who brought it. "My dear Miss Marple, you will never guess what I have just heard," she exclaimed, bursting into the room without ceremony. "I seldom attempt to guess," said Miss Marple. "It is so often inaccurate." "Well, I have it on very good authority that Mrs. Clements was seen near the coffee shop early that morning." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, her interest quickening. "Yes, before it was supposed to open, quite early." "That is most interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And there is more. Apparently, she and Mrs. Price had a most unpleasant altercation only the day before." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Miss Hartnell," she said, "you have been most helpful." That evening, Miss Marple sat alone, her thoughts weaving together the various strands of the case. A blackmailer with multiple victims, a missing sum of money, a vanished gentleman who might or might not be guilty, a respectable lady seen where she ought not to be, and a single cup of coffee. She closed her eyes for a moment. "In human nature," she murmured, "there are certain patterns that repeat themselves with remarkable consistency. One sees them in villages, in families, even in the smallest domestic arrangements." She opened her eyes again. "Yes," she said softly, "it is very like the case of Mrs. Simpkin's jam cupboard." For Miss Marple, such comparisons were never trivial. They were, in fact, the very foundation of her understanding. And now, at last, something was beginning to take shape. Not a complete picture, far from it, but a pattern. And patterns, once recognized, had a way of revealing the truth. As the village settled into uneasy silence that night, Miss Marple rose and moved to her window. The Willow Bean coffee shop stood dark and still at the end of the lane. "It closed too early," she said quietly. But now, she believed, she was beginning to understand why, and more importantly, who had closed it. The following morning dawned grey and subdued, as though the sky itself had grown weary of St. Mary Mead's mounting tensions. A thin drizzle softened the outlines of hedges and rooftops, blurring the familiar into something faintly uncertain. It was, Miss Marple thought, an appropriate setting for clarity. For it was on such mornings, quiet, unremarkable, and faintly melancholy, that the truth had a way of presenting itself with the most disarming simplicity. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly at 10 o'clock. "You sent for me," he said, removing his hat as he entered Miss Marple's sitting room. "Yes," said Miss Jane Marple. "I believe I can now explain what happened at the Willow Bean." The inspector's expression sharpened. "You are certain as one ever can be in such matters," Miss Marple replied. "Though I shall rely upon you to confirm the final details." He sat down opposite her. "I am all attention." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Let us begin," she said, "with the coffee." "The poison," Miss Marple continued, "was administered in Mrs. Price's coffee. That much is clear. But there is something most peculiar about the circumstances." "The single cup," said the inspector. "Precisely. A coffee shop owner, preparing to open for the day, would not ordinarily serve herself alone, certainly not before opening. Her routine, by all accounts, was most consistent. Yes, and yet, we find her with a single cup of coffee and no indication of any customer." Inspector Craddock frowned. "Which suggests she was not serving anyone else, or," said Miss Marple, "that she believed she was." The inspector leaned forward slightly. "Go on." "You see," Miss Marple said gently, "Mrs. Price was a woman who dealt in secrets. She had, it seems, established a rather profitable arrangement extracting money from those who wished to keep certain matters concealed. Blackmail," said the inspector. "Yes, and such an arrangement requires meetings, private meetings, conducted discreetly. Before opening hours," Craddock suggested. "Just so. Early in the morning, when the village is quiet, and one may come and go without attracting attention." The inspector nodded slowly. "So she was expecting someone." "I believe she was," said Miss Marple. "And that person came. But here," she continued, "we must consider character." Inspector Craddock smiled faintly. "Your favorite subject. Me only reliable guide," Miss Marple replied. "Now, let us consider the individuals involved." She raised a finger. "Mr. Basil Trent, a charming but untrustworthy man. He has now disappeared, which naturally casts suspicion upon him. But his type is well known to me. Such men rely upon persuasion, not violence. If he had wished to silence Mrs. Price, he would have done so in a manner far less conspicuous, or not at all. You believe his disappearance is a diversion?" "I believe he is running from something," said Miss Marple, "but not from this. Mr. Finch," she went on, "is resentful, certainly, but cautious. He lacks both the imagination and the nerve for such a crime. Miss Dunning? A gentle soul, as I have said. Deep feelings, perhaps, but not of a destructive nature. And Lady Bantry?" Miss Marple smiled. "My dear Inspector, Dolly Bantry may be many things, but she is not a murderess. Her involvement is purely unfortunate." "Which leaves," said the inspector slowly, "Mrs. Clements." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Miss Edith Clements." The name seemed to settle heavily in the room. "She had motive," said Craddock. "A prior disagreement. And if Mrs. Price was indeed blackmailing her, then the motive becomes considerably stronger." Miss Marple agreed. "She was seen near the shop that morning." Indeed she was, and she had the opportunity." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But motive and opportunity, while necessary, are not sufficient. One must also consider the method." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but precise. "The poison was in the coffee. But the question is, whose coffee?" The inspector frowned. "Miss Price's." "Was it?" said Miss Marple. He hesitated. "You see," she continued, "we have assumed that the coffee was prepared by Mrs. Price for herself. But what if that assumption is incorrect? Then who prepared it?" "Mrs. Clements," said Miss Marple quietly. Inspector Craddock stared at her. "You believe Mrs. Clements made the coffee?" "Yes." "But why would Mrs. Price allow that?" "Because she trusted her," Miss Marple replied, "or at least, did not distrust her sufficiently." She paused. "Imagine the scene. Mrs. Price has arranged to meet Mrs. Clements early in the morning, perhaps to demand a final payment, perhaps to threaten exposure. Yes, Mrs. Clements arrives. She is composed, perhaps even conciliatory. She offers to make the coffee. A small, domestic gesture, perfectly natural, and Mrs. Price accepts. Of course. Why should she not?" Miss Marple's voice grew quieter still. "But Mrs. Clements has brought something with her. A small vial of poison." "The one we found," said the inspector. "Just so. She prepares the coffee, and adds the poison. And then, she waits," said Miss Marple. "But here, something unexpected occurs." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "What?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "Miss Price does not drink the coffee immediately." The inspector blinked. "Why not?" "Because she is cautious. A woman who lives by blackmail does not trust easily. She may have been distracted, or suspicious, or simply inclined to delay, and Mrs. Clements becomes uneasy," said Miss Marple. "Time is passing. The shop will soon open. Someone may arrive. And so, Miss Marple continued, she does something desperate. The inspector's voice was very quiet. What? She insists that Mrs. Price drink. Insists. Yes. Perhaps lightly. Perhaps with a joke, but firmly enough to compel and Mrs. Price drinks, said Miss Marple. A silence followed. And dies, said the inspector. Yes, but what about the single cup, he asked. If Mrs. Clements made the coffee, why was there only one cup? Miss Marple smiled. Because Mrs. Clements never intended to drink. The inspector sat back slowly. And after, she places the vial on the counter, perhaps intending to suggest suicide, or at least confusion. Then she leaves, and the money. Taken, said Miss Marple. Either before or after the act. A final attempt to remove both motive and evidence. Inspector Craddock was silent for a long moment. It fits, he said at last. It fits very well. There is one more thing, Miss Marple added. Yes, the matter of the coffee shop closing early. The inspector frowned. Yes? It did not close early at all, said Miss Marple. He looked at her sharply. It never opened, she said. The simplicity of it seemed, for a moment, almost absurd. Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Price began her preparations. The scones were baked, the cups arranged, everything ready. Then Mrs. Clements arrived. Yes, and within minutes, it was all over. Inspector Craddock rose slowly. I shall have Mrs. Clements brought in at once. Miss Marple inclined her head. I think, she said gently, that you will find she has been waiting for this. As he reached the door, the inspector paused. One question, Miss Marple. Yes. How did you know? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear inspector, it is always the same. People imagine that such things are complicated. But they are not. They are merely human. Aunt Mrs. Clements, a woman who found herself cornered, said Miss Marple softly, and chose the only escape she could see. The door closed behind him. Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, and somewhere in the village, the truth so long concealed was at last beginning to come into the light. The final act of the drama unfolded with far less noise than one might have expected. There was no public spectacle, no dramatic chase through the hedgerows, nor any impassioned confession before a gathered crowd. Instead, it came quietly, almost gently, like the settling of dust after a long disturbance. Mrs. Edith Clements did not resist arrest. Inspector Craddock would later remark that she received the accusation with a composure that was, in its way, more unsettling than any denial. I wondered how long it would take, she had said simply. It was on a mild afternoon, some days later, that Miss Jane Marple was invited to the Bantry residence for tea. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall was as comfortable and familiar as ever, though its occupants bore faint traces of recent strain. Dolly Bantry, however, seemed much restored to her usual spirits. My dear Miss Marple, she declared, as she poured tea with renewed vigor, I cannot tell you what a relief it is to have the whole dreadful business cleared up. I am very glad of it, said Miss Marple, accepting her cup. Colonel Bantry, seated by the window, gave a satisfied nod. Damned unpleasant affair. But Craddock seems to have handled it well. Yes, said Miss Marple. He is a most capable officer. Lady Bantry leaned forward eagerly. And to think it was Mrs. Clements all along, such a quiet, respectable woman. One would never have suspected it. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. One rarely does. Lady Bantry shuddered slightly. To poison someone in such a cold-blooded manner, I cannot imagine it. On the contrary, said Miss Marple gently, I can imagine it very well. The others looked at her. You see, she continued, Mrs. Clements was not, in essence, a wicked woman. She was proud, very proud, and deeply concerned with her position in the village. Well, that is hardly a crime, said the Colonel. No, Miss Marple agreed, but it can lead to one. She set down her cup. Miss Price had discovered something damaging, perhaps a financial indiscretion, or a personal matter that Mrs. Clements could not afford to have exposed. At first, she paid. Many people do, in such circumstances. It seems the easiest way, but it never ends, does it? Lady Bantry said. No, said Miss Marple. It never ends, and sooner or later, the victim of such demands begins to feel trapped, which is precisely what happened here, Miss Marple went on. Miss Clements realized that as long as Miss Price lived, she would never be free. So she decided to kill her, said the Colonel bluntly. Yes, said Miss Marple, but not in anger, not in haste. She planned it carefully. Lady Bantry shivered again. That is the most dreadful part. Indeed. said Miss Marple. She chose a method that was quiet, efficient, and she believed unlikely to draw suspicion. Poison in a cup of coffee, a simple, domestic act, and yet, said the Colonel, it was discovered. Yes, said Miss Marple, because even the most careful plans are subject to small imperfections. She smiled faintly. In this case, it was the matter of the single cup. Lady Bantry nodded eagerly. Yes, you mentioned that before. I remember thinking it odd at the time. As well you might, said Miss Marple, for it told us something very important, that Mrs. Clements never intended to share the coffee. And the vial? Asked the Colonel. A mistake, said Miss Marple. She left it behind, perhaps in haste, perhaps believing it would suggest suicide, but it did not fit the character of Mrs. Price, who was far too practical for such a dramatic gesture. Lady Bantry sighed. And that dreadful Mr. Trent running away like that. I was quite convinced it must be him. Yes, said Miss Marple. He provided a most convenient distraction. Then he had nothing to do with it. Not directly, said Miss Marple, though I suspect he had his own reasons for leaving. A man of his sort seldom lingers where there is trouble. The conversation paused for a moment, as the quiet comfort of the room reasserted itself. Outside, the garden lay peaceful once more. The hedges stood neat and orderly, the flowers bright despite the season's slow turning. St. Mary Mead, it seemed, was returning to itself. And what of the money? Lady Bantry asked suddenly. Recovered, said Miss Marple, hidden among Mrs. Clement's belongings. It seems she intended to make a fresh start elsewhere. How foolish, said the Colonel. She must have known she would be caught. Miss Marple shook her head. Not foolish, merely desperate. Lady Bantry looked thoughtful. Do you pity her? Miss Marple considered. I pity the circumstances, she said at last. But one must never forget that she made a choice. And that choice cost another person her life. There was a quiet gravity in her words that lingered for a moment. Then Lady Bantry, with a characteristic return to practicality, brightened. Well, at least it is all over, and I can once again walk through the village without feeling as though I am being watched. Miss Marple smiled. I should not rely too much upon that, my dear. Villages are always watching. They laughed, and the tension eased. Later, as Miss Marple made her way home along the familiar lane, she paused briefly at the spot where the Willow Bean coffee shop stood. Its windows were still shuttered, though a small notice had been placed upon the door. Closed until further notice. Miss Marple regarded it thoughtfully. It is a pity, she murmured. It was a very pleasant place. She reflected, as she often did, on the curious nature of human affairs. A simple village, a modest coffee shop, a handful of ordinary people, each with their own small secrets. And yet, from such unremarkable elements, a tragedy had arisen. But then, she said softly, that is always the way of it. She resumed her walk, her figure small but steady against the quiet backdrop of St. Mary Mead. Behind her, the village settled once more into its accustomed rhythm, outwardly unchanged, yet subtly altered by what had passed. For those who lived there would remember. And for Miss Jane Marple, the lesson, like so many before it, would be quietly stored away, ready to illuminate some future mystery. The coffee shop, she said to herself, with a faint knowing smile, closed too early, because someone wished it never to open again.